The clock hit 2 a.m., a sharp scratch, then another. Then a howl, raw and desperate, ripped through the silence. Lisa jolted awake beside her. Jake groaned again. She muttered Kota had been restless before. But this was different. But when they got up to scold him, they noticed something was off. Dizzy, disoriented and confused, they stumbled forward, only to find their baby lying completely still in her crib. Lisa and Jake Harper snuggled into a soft couch in their pretty suburban home. They were too exhausted to think of anything but sleep in the other room. In a large wooden crib lay the reason for their exhaustion. Baby Sophie. She was curled beneath a pink blanket, and the glow of the baby monitor shone a soft blue light in the nursery. But this peaceful night was about to end horribly. Jake and Lisa could not sense the danger in the air. They were only glad their baby had finally dozed off, and that their dog had fallen asleep too. Their dog, Kota, was a large, restless husky, whose antics had been driving them crazy. He would tear up furniture, dig up the garden, and bark noisily all day. I swear if that dog ruins one more piece of furniture, I'm putting him up for adoption myself, Lisa joked. Jake only chuckled. You say that every week, but deep in his mind he was considering it too. They hoped he would let them sleep that night, but were soon terribly disappointed. The culprit, Kota, was sprawled across the hardwood floor downstairs, snoring with no care in the world. But as the clock ticked idly by, his nose began to twitch. Suddenly his eyes snapped open and he sniffed the air, then let out a panicked bark. Something very strange had woken him upstairs. Lisa and Jake were not aware their restless dog had woken. They were fast asleep and were already dreaming. But not for long. A low scrape, then another clawing, desperate. Kota wasn't just scratching, he was digging, tearing at the wood, his frantic paws leaving deep marks. But Jake and Lisa slept on. Suddenly something heavy slammed against the door, followed by a very loud bark. Lisa's eyes flew open. Another loud bark made her spring up. She exhaled and rubbed her eyes in frustration. Not again. Kota was beginning to get on her last nerves. But do you think Kota was up to his usual tantrums, or do you think something else was wrong? Lisa dropped back into the sheet. She was sure Kota was just being a pain again. What else could he be barking about? She was about to drift off to sleep when something hit the door with a louder thud. She groaned and sat up. She squinted at the clock on the nightstand and saw it was already 2:03 a.m. Outside, the scratching was followed by something even worse. Howling. Oh, for God's sake, Lisa yelled and turned to wake Jake. Jake grumbled awake as the sleep cleared from his eyes. The howling immediately made him grab his temples. What is wrong with him now? He groaned. But Kota's howls became louder and louder. It was as if he was trying to tell them something. They decided to ignore him, but then things started. Ed feeling strange at last. Jake could take it no longer and jumped out of bed. Might as well check, so he'll shut up. I swear if he chewed up the couch again. But something happened that shocked him. The moment Jake stood, the floor lurched beneath him. His legs buckled. He grabbed the bedpost. Heart pounding, he blinked. What just happened? Something was wrong, and Kota's barking wasn't helping. He stumbled out of the bedroom and to the door that led to the stairs. He opened the door, ready to scold him. But Kota bolted past him. Jake shouted for him to stop, but the dog flew straight for the nursery before they could recover from that strange action. He began barking again. What is wrong with you? Lisa yelled from her bed, but they were in for more shock. Kota began flinging his body against the nursery door while still barking. He's going to wake Sophie. Lisa scrambled up, but as she got up, she too staggered and even began to cough. A wave of nausea hit her, and something thick settled in her chest. She did not stop, though she struggled to the door, just in time to see Kota run to Jake, throw himself at him, and run back to throw himself at the nursery door. They exchanged shocked glances. What was that? Kota was a pain. But this was very unusual for him. This was something else. Why do you think he was acting this way? Was he trying to tell them something about Sophie? Well, Lisa's eyes rounded immediately when she realized that with all that noise, Sophie had not woken up. Jake realized it almost at the same time too, and he immediately tried to march forward to check her out. But he also realized his dizziness had gotten worse. He wondered if it was the caffeine he took before bed, but he was too worried about Sophie to think it through. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. He tried to walk faster, but his nausea seemed to become stronger with each step. "Do you feel weird too?" he asked Lisa, and she nodded slowly. It must have been the caffeine. She too was suffering the same fate. She felt very groggy and her limbs were very heavy, but they did not stop. They kept walking until they finally reached the nursery. Jake pushed the dog aside, reached for the handle, and opened the door. He froze. The room was as quiet as a graveyard. The baby monitor had gone off and something in the air felt very heavy and toxic. But baby Sophie was still in her crib. "She's fine," Lisa exhaled in relief. They were about to turn away when Kota suddenly rushed forward. He jumped onto the crib's edge and began whining. Lisa wanted to scold him, but she glanced at Sophie and frowned. She walked up to the crib. Something about her posture looks. Lisa froze. She had just touched her daughter, and she was very cold and still. Jake, her voice shook. "Jake, she's not Jake." Turned, and he finally noticed the blue tinge on her lips. His stomach dropped. "Oh my God," he whispered. Lisa's scream shattered the quiet night. Her daughter felt too limp, too light, as if life itself had drained from her small frame. Sophie, her voice cracked. She shook her gently, her fingers pressing against her daughter's back, desperate for any sign of breath. "No, no, 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 Sophie, wake up, baby." She begged, but nothing happened. Jake's heart dropped to his feet and the walls seemed to close in. His baby wasn't breathing. Why wasn't she breathing? The room began to spin, but it was not from shock or grief. Something else clawed at his neck and chest. This was nausea worse than he had ever felt it, and his swooning head began to feel disconnected from his body. He began to wheeze and cough, and he grabbed the crib to steady himself, but it did not help much beside him. Lisa was swooning too. She gasped and grabbed his shirt to keep herself from falling. What was happening? Why was it so hard to stand? Why was everything tilting? Just then they heard a growl. Jake barely registered the sound before Kota lunged forward and bit down on his sleeve. "What the Jake?" yelled as Kota began yanking him hard. "Kota, stop," he yelled, but Kota did not let go. Lisa's own breath was becoming shorter now, and she had to struggle to hold her baby. She clutched her head. Surprised, "Why do I feel so light-headed?" It was at that point Jake finally understood. He turned to the dog, tugging at his shirt, and gasped. Kota had not been up to his usual antics. He had been trying to warn them all along. He had been trying to warn them about Sophie, but why was he acting up again, and why was there panic in the husky's eyes? Jake's breath hitched, sluggish, dazed heavy air. His eyes darted to the baby monitor. Dead. This wasn't just Sophie. This was killing all of them. His stomach clenched. His throat burned carbon monoxide. His stomach dropped as he did. The math. Carbon monoxide, Lisa run. The words came out, strangled and hoarse, but they were loud enough to be understood. He did not wait for her to respond. He wrenched Sophie from her arms, and even though his legs felt as heavy as lead, he began to move. Lise responded slowly. Her legs buckled, but Kota jumped and pushed against her legs to nudge her toward the door. Jake noticed. He turned back, grabbed her wrist and forced her forward with him. His breath was shallow now, and every inhale he took hurt his chest badly. He felt faint and knew he did not have enough time left, but he had to do it. He had to save his family. He pushed forward as forcefully as he could. Every step was a battle, and the hallway stretched endlessly ahead. Kota barked again, frantic. He refused to run ahead of them and kept barking behind them to keep them awake and moving. They managed to stumble down the stairs, and the front door loomed ahead. So close, Jake gritted his teeth. One more step. 2 steps. 4. Jake reached the front door, but the lock refused to cooperate with his numb fingers. His lungs were burning now, and his vision was beginning to shut down. They had only a few seconds to get out. One last try. It worked. The lock gave. Jake threw open the front door and stumbled outside with Sophie in his arms. Air-cold, sharp and fresh air sliced into his throat like a blade the moment his foot crossed the threshold. It rushed into his lungs, and he gasped in relief as it began to chase away the heavy dizziness. Lisa sagged against the doorframe. Her fingers slipped, her knees buckled. "Lisa, move." Jake's voice cracked, but she was falling. Kota lunged, shoving her forward with a last ounce of strength. He pulled her forward, and she collapsed on the porch with a strangled gasp. Kota finally jumped over her and bounded outside, barking happily. They had made it, but Jake had no time to be happy because of Sophie, his baby. She was still unconscious, even though they had escaped the toxic air. He pulled out his phone with shaky hands and immediately dialed 911 in front of him. Lisa staggered up, and her strangled SOB tore through the night. Her hand shook as she reached for their daughter. "Sophie, please." She began to beg again when she was in her arms. "Please wake up." But Sophie remained still. Instinct and desperation finally merged into one. Lisa immediately dropped to her knees and began doing something quite strange. She began to press her trembling fingers against Sophie's tiny chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted desperately as she pressed. Jake did not stop her. He too held on to faint hope that it might work. His pulse pounded so violently he could hear it in his ears. "Come on, baby," Lisa gasped. "Please nothing. No breath. No sound." Jake's chest caved, his vision blurred, not from poison, but from something worse. Grief. Lisa's voice cracked as she pressed again. "Breathe, Sophie," and then they heard it, a small, tiny sigh. Jake's entire body woke up. His eyes widened, and they almost exploded when Sophie's tiny chest heaved. Lisa let out a scream, and Kota began to bark. Did she just? Yes. She had Sophie's lips parted, and she let out a cough. It was a weak cough, but it was very real. Lisa burst into tears, but they were tears of joy. She pulled Sophie against her chest and began to rock her. Jake's lungs still burned, but none of it mattered. Sophie was breathing. She was alive. It was at that moment the sirens came. They sounded distant at first, but the red and blue lights soon painted the neighborhood. Paramedics flew out from the cars before the vehicle stopped, and they rushed towards them. Jake barely registered the hands on his shoulders, the shouting voices, the oxygen mask being pressed against his face. All he could do was stare at his family, at Lisa C. and Sophie, and at Kota, his hero who had saved everyone. The paramedics immediately tested the air in the house, and they shook their heads. If you had stayed inside for a few more minutes, one of them told him, but he didn't need to finish. He knew exactly what would have happened. He turned to Kota and ran a hand through his fur, thanking him he had saved them. They were all still alive because of him. An hour later, they found themselves in a hospital, and the steady beep of the monitors in the hospital room reminded Jake and Lisa of how close they had come to losing everything. Jake sat in a stiff plastic chair with his elbows resting on his knees across from him. Sophie lay in a hospital crib, her tiny chest rising and falling. A nasal cannula was attached to her, and it delivered oxygen into her little lungs. She looked weak, but she was alive. Lisa could not let go of her hand. "She's okay," she whispered, her voice still shaky. "She's really okay." Jake swallowed hard. They had almost lost her. They had almost lost everything. Their home had nearly killed them. The home they had tried to protect from Kota had almost killed them, while Kota had saved them. The baby monitor had failed, the alarms would have stayed silent. If it hadn't been for Kota, Jake ran a hand through his hair. They had joked about getting rid of him. They had complained about his mischief, his antics, and the messes he made. And yet when it mattered most, Kota had saved them. Lisa must have been thinking the same thing, because she suddenly let out a small laugh. We really don't deserve him, do we? Jake's lips spread in a tight smile. Number we don't, Lisa turned to him. We need to do better. Jake nodded. Yeah, we do, he whispered. 3 days later, they walked through their front door again. The house felt different, but it was still there. Lisa hesitated in the doorway. Jake caught the hesitation and reached for her hand. It won't happen again. She nodded, but the unease did not leave her face. They had taken every precaution now. They had installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room. They had fixed new alarms with fresh batteries, and yet the fear still lingered living room and turned toward the kitchen. He froze at the figure. He saw Kota, their husk. He had been with a neighbor, but now he was there behind the back door, ears perked, tail wagging, watching them, waiting for a moment. Nobody moved. Then Lisa ran to the door and opened it. Kota! She yelled. Kota did not hesitate. He bounded forward and jumped on her, his large body pressed into hers as she wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his fur. Jake knelt beside them and ran a hand through Kota's thick coat. We owe you everything. Buddy Kota gave a soft woof and licked Jake's chin, making Lisa laugh. We're never letting you go, ever, she told him. They had not expected their little story to spread. It started with a simple post that Lisa shared on a local community page about what had happened. But then a news outlet picked it up, and soon their inbox was flooded. People were touched by their stories and also shared stories of their own pets, dogs who had sent fires before alarms, cats who had woken owners during seizures, and even birds that had screamed warnings of gas leaks. It blew up into robust conversations, and experts also got involved, explaining how dogs with their heightened senses could detect changes in the air long before humans could. One article called Kota a miracle dog. Another referred to him as the hero husky Jake. And Lisa did not care about the attention. They only cared about the lesson. They had almost dismissed their own dogs' desperate attempts to save them. Never again. A few nights after they returned, Jake and Lisa stood in the nursery doorway watching Sophie sleep. And beside the crib, his body pressed protectively against the door, was Kota. Lisa exhaled and pressed into Jake's side, while Jake wrapped an arm around her. They had almost given up on him, and yet he had never given up on them. Kota was not just a pet, he was their guardian angel in disguise. This story reminds us to be kinder to our pets, as they are also quite intelligent and deserve to be treated with kindness and with love. However, Kota was not the only animal that sensed danger before it was too late. If this story amazed you, wait until you hear about the dog who refused to leave a hospital room because he knew something no one else did. Click in now to watch.